So it's 2 o'clock, so we'll make the most of the afternoon. Hope everybody's well wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Jacob Krzyzanowski, and it's been my absolute pleasure to be invited to bring you through today as your acting chair. I have a background as a clinical psychiatrist, and I have been working with CSH off and on for the years and currently help support their work as an associate. So in the time, if you wouldn't just mind bringing us a bit together by introducing yourself in the chat, where you're from, what your interests are, and just feed them in through so people can have a better sense of what makes this group today. And this is the 2022 NHS Forest Conference, and this year we follow on from last year with the theme on biodiversity and resilience. The NHS Forest is a project run by the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, which has brought this amazing event together. And is part of its Green Space for Health program. And if you've had a chance to kind of get oriented with the structure of the day for the conference, effectively, it's divided into 3 general sessions. At the beginning, we have our keynote speakers, including Lucy Jones, Dom Higgins, and Andrew Tenpenny. And then we'll move on to a second session, which will look to give you a bit more of a sense of the case studies to think about how these themes can be implemented practically. And then we will go into our breakout groups with various sessions for questions and answers throughout. And so it's my absolute pleasure to present our first speaker and keynote to Lucy Jones, the author of Losing Eden: Why Our Minds Need the Wild. So some of you will probably, or many of you will already be familiar with Lucy's work. Lucy is an author and journalist based in Hampshire. Her first book, Foxes on Earth, was celebrated for its brave, bold, and honest account of our relationship with the fox. I know that even in my area in South London, there's foxes abound everywhere. It's sort of one of our local neighbors. She went on to win the Society of Authors Roger Deakin Award. Her second book, the best-selling Losing Eden, which you can see pictured here, Why Our Minds Need the Wild, was a Times and Telegraph Book of the Year. Her third book, The Nature Seed, is about sharing the natural world with children. Again, the sort of generational components of this wider discussion are ever present. Her writing on culture, science, and nature has been published in BBC Earth, BBC Wildlife, The Sunday Times, The Guardian, and The New Statesman. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand over to Lucy to walk us through her talk. Thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Everyone can hear me, can they? Yes. It is an enormous pleasure to open the conference and to be here with you all. There are so many people. I think it might be the biggest group of people I've ever talked to, and it's a huge honour to be with you today and to be able to share something of my work with you. As Jacob mentioned, I'm an author and journalist, and I think the theme of this year's conference, Resilience and Biodiversity, is just incredibly important and inspired. And for me personally, it was quite an important part of the beginning of my research journey. So to tell you briefly a little bit about me before I properly start, I about 12 years ago found myself living in London, a very kind of urban life. I was a journalist. I'd just moved from the Telegraph into more science journalism, and I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and I went into recovery for addiction issues, which really brought me to my knees. And I was very low in resilience, but what I found was that spending time in my nearest biodiverse space, which was Walthamstow Marshes, was an incredibly important part of my recovery. I knew that psychiatry and psychotherapy and support groups would be helpful, and I kind of knew how they worked, but the power and the strength of this relationship I started with the natural world kind of mystified me, and that's what sent me on my research journey, which was to explore and investigate the evidence for the relationship between the natural world and human mental health, and look at the most compelling and engaging work I could find. So I'm going to take a couple of things for granted before I start. One is that When we talk about resilience, I mean, it's such a big and important word, but I'm going to take for granted that we all understand that our lives and our fundamental resilience depends on biodiversity, because that's how we eat and breathe and drink and so on. And I'm going to focus more on resilience in the context of mental health. And particularly, I'm going to look at stress and coping with stress and well-being and weathering the world. I'm very aware that NHS staff in particular over the last few years have been under acute stress. And I really hope that what I'm going to share with you might be useful in giving people permission to go into natural environments and find restoration there. I'm also going to take it for granted that I'm sure all understand that there's now this big, compelling, robust evidence base, which, while very complex, tells us that biodiverse environments, natural restorative places, are crucial for good health and well-being. So I'm not going to go through the many thousands of epidemiological studies that add up to this unequivocal picture that we need contact and connection with the living world. So, for example, we know that if you live on a street with more trees, that is associated with fewer antidepressant prescriptions. If you live near coastal areas, blue space, that's associated with high well-being, and so on. So instead, what I want to talk about today is what it actually means when we talk about biodiversity and resilience. What does it mean that when we talk about nature and mental health? So we all kind of know that being in a park or a wood or by the sea is in some way good for us. And even people who don't work in our wider areas intuit that. They spend time in the parks on the weekend or go to the seaside on their holidays. But what does that actually mean? What does it feel like? What's happening to our brains and our bodies? How can it build our resilience? What is actually happening in that relationship? What are the pathways? And to do that, I want to take you on a walk. I don't have very long, so this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the most, I think, exciting and compelling evidence that I found in my research. And I share it with you because as much as we might know this, I think our culture thinks spending time in nature is nice or a luxury or a kind of commodity or a privilege, when actually what I hope I will suggest today, and as you know, it will be underpinning many of your work, it is a right and it's an important part of public health. So this morning I dropped my daughter off at school and I walked through what could be called a very unbiodiverse green space. It's a big playing field, an amenity lawn, just kind of straight grass. Of course, there'll be biodiversity in the soil, but as green spaces go, there was not much going on. Yes, I felt kind of a sense of spaciousness with the sky above. There was a red kite, which was lovely to see. But the experience of walking through that area was pretty minimal. So I want to take you with me now into where I went after that. I walked into a cemetery where I live in Basingstoke, Hampshire, a pretty standard green space that you would find in towns and cities, with a pretty kind of average amount of creatures and beings and natural factors. And I want to tell you about what happened on that walk, and what can happen on that walk, kind of nature affecting us from our heads to our toes. So I walk through and the first thing I see is a beautiful birch tree, and the leaves are kind of shaking really gently in the wind. And I fix on that and I look at it and I look at the kind of, I'm softly fascinated by what's happening. And I know from my research that there's evidence that moments of soft fascination in natural spaces can restore our attention, can give our cognitive minds a break. So I start to look at the trees. And then I look at the different flowers. There's clover on the floor, there's kind of lady's bed straw, and things are moving, and I'm just kind of plugging myself into it. And as I walk through, It's a lovely wild cemetery, really old, and there's lots of lovely trees. I start to feel my body relax. And partly that will be because there's no cars and I'm kind of away from my work and my caring responsibilities. But it's also, I know, because of the evidence, that it could be because my parasympathetic nervous system is more likely to be activated in natural spaces. And we are more likely to recover from stress quickly and more completely in natural environments. Additionally, being in that natural space will be buffering the air pollution, which we know there's now mounting evidence that air pollution affects inflammation and can even increase risk of psychiatric illness. So I'm wandering along and I start to zoom in on some of the plants. And what I find that I'm doing is looking at fractal shapes. Now, I'm sure lots of you will know about fractal shapes. They're found all over the natural world. This is a little example. So you've got one shape and it's self-repeating in different sizes. So you find them in leaves, trees, fractal broccoli, lightning, salt flats, all over the place. And I really like using this example because it's a really easy way of increasing nature connection, because you can find them in pavement plants or in a weed in the crack of a pavement. And what I find really exciting is that some research from the scientist Richard Taylor finds that when the human brain looks at a fractal shape with the particular dimensions found in nature, it associates areas of the brain, activates areas of the brain associated with wellness and well-being and calmness and relaxation. Let's stay with the brain a little bit more. So I'm wandering through this wild space, and I find that my rumination and brooding is starting to kind of fade. I'm not worrying about the different issues that I might have at the moment. I'm looking at the trees. And I know that a very interesting neuroscience study, and the neuroscience around this area is very early and fledgling, but it found that rumination and brooding can be reduced when people walk through more natural areas with trees. It rained last night, and I find that I'm kind of smelling, I'm breathing more in that area, and I can vaguely smell the smell of petrichor, which is the word for the smell of the earth after it's rained. That kind of earthy metallic smell. And I take a bit of time just to smell it, because I know that the compound within petrichor, which is called geosmin, has been found in studies, again, to activate areas of the brain associated with calmness and relaxation, which would make sense when you consider that we spent 99% of our evolutionary history outside, where finding irrigated landscapes would have been crucial for our survival. So being able to smell that beautiful smell would have been associated with positivity. Now I'm going through the area and I find my favorite tree, which is a huge beech tree, really beautiful, just changes all through the year. And underneath it is this kind of lake of pink cyclamen. And I find big old trees just triggering me this kind of sense of awe. It's the bigness, the vastness of them, the fact they're this kind of this vibrant habitat, the colors of the leaves. And I remember the science of awe, and I think about the very compelling research which shows that when the human body experiences awe, more so than any other emotion, we have this physiological effect. So studies suggest that feeling awe is associated with lower levels of cytokines, which are biomarkers for inflammation. And the work of Dasha Keltner, who steers this area, has found that we have this measurable effect on our bodies when we experience awe, which I think is just another reason why connecting with these awe experiences, which we still find most of the time in nature, is not something just nice or a luxury. It's actually something really important for our health. I sit under the tree and I pick up a stick and I'm scratching around in the beech mast. I often just sit there, and people often come up to me and say, "Are you okay?" But I think they're kind of getting used to it. And I know that okay, I'm not huffing the soil, I'm not kind of down there sniffing the soil, but I know that a greater diversity of exposure to microbacteria is associated with serotonin-like, antidepressant-like effects on the brain. So all of this research is in my book, and I don't have time to go into it too much. But there's a microbe called Myco which is found in soil, which has been found in studies to have these antidepressant-like effects. It's being used as being trialed as a treatment for PTSD. And it speaks to the old friend hypothesis, this idea that we evolved over our history with these microbacteria, with these old friends. So I spend a bit of time kind of touching the soil, scratching around. And then the last area that I will talk about is the kind of the social factor and the community of that area. So we're social animals, and there is something very kind of potentially resilient making about being in those spaces with other people, sharing those experiences. I sometimes join a conservation group where we try and work on the area. It's also a place of memory, of walking with friends, of feeding my children under the trees in the heat waves when it's so hot and it's the only place in the town that we could go to be quiet. As I'm walking back, and I know I have to finish up now, I listen out for the bird song, and I know that birdsong is associated with lowering levels of cortisol and stress. And there's so many different types of birdsong in this area because it's biodiverse. There's clumps of nettles, there's clumps of brambles, there's all sorts of different trees. So I have all these different pathways going on around me. I can't hear the road and the trains so much. The noise pollution is less. It's silent, but for the sound of the wind in the trees. I mention all of these because I want to paint you a picture of how a biodiverse environment can interact with the human body and the brain. From a health perspective, the greater the biodiversity, the greater the number of potential therapeutic pathways and interactions. And a couple of studies I think really speak to resilience. One is a study in the States which found that children who are at disadvantage, so children who had experienced some kind of stressful situation, the presence of a natural environment seemed to buffer the stress. So when we talk about resilience being like this ability to bounce back and to cope with life, we have evidence that the natural environment can really help that with children. Another study done by a group in Edinburgh found that when people walk through the natural environment and then into a very busy urban environment, measuring the brain suggested that that time in that natural environment buffered the stress of moving into the urban environment.
1 minute
So
remaining.
my time's coming to the end, but I hope that I have communicated to you how this relationship is not just nice, not just a luxury, it's measurable, it's powerful, and it's critical.
Lucy, there's just rounds of virtual applause amongst over 200 attendants. So thank you so much. I think it's really impressive to be able to be in our chairs and to actually be able to communicate. I mean, both the science, but I think also the feeling and the experience, because I think ultimately that's what we're all advocating for. So thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm now going to hand over and briefly introduce Dom Higgins, who I've had the pleasure of working with at various points in the past. And Dom also represents a key sort of node within this entire discussion about how we look towards incorporating nature into health more widely. So Dom has been involved in the natural health agenda for quite some time. Today, he is head of health and education at the Wildlife Trust, which I think is an amazing title for a job, where he leads their policy and campaigning work in these areas. He's also a member of the Green Prescribing for Mental Health Advisory Group and chairs Wildlife and Countryside Links Nature and Wellbeing Strategy Group. In the education world, he sits on the OCR Strategic Advisory Board, who are behind the plans for a new GCSE in natural history. Prior to working for the Wildlife Trust, he was Director of External Affairs at TCV, where he led on the development of the Green Gyms unit, one of the original green prescriptions. So clearly has been around for some time, understanding the space and thinking about how to move things forward. Dom, it's my pleasure to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I'm delighted to have been described as being around for some time. I just want to, before I took into the kind of aspects of policy and some of the things that Vicky has asked me to touch on today, I just want to say thank you to Lucy there. I was absolutely enthralled, actually, and I have to say I could have continued on that walk through Hampshire, and it's that sort of thing that that's driven what I do over the years. It's quite important when you talk about resilience to go out and see the things you're talking about, and I don't do that often enough. But actually hearing people's authentic experiences about what it means, I never tire of that. You can meet people who talk about it's helped them to come outside of their house for the first time in 2 years, or it's somebody that shares the experience that they have had throughout their working life, and through that really kind of rich social mix. So I'm just going to bank that with a lot of the other stuff, and keep that there, because it's that sort of thing, I think, that when you talk about the amount of time I've been involved, my own resilience has been quite sorely tested, I think. It's pleasing today. I'm feeling very positive and uplifted today, and generally around the direction we're going around nature, health and well-being. Back in the day, if you walked into a room of either clinicians or somebody in the Department of Health and Social Care, and I was wearing my chestnut leaf lapel or the badger, as it is now, I get some really blank looks, as if to almost say, well, what the hell are you doing here? And sometimes quite literally, people might say, what the hell are you doing here? That has really been left behind. And I have a great confidence, not only in the practitioners we see here today, people throughout the health services who are actually driving a lot of thought, particularly the green prescribing, and a lot of the kind of delivery and inspiration. So yeah, I think it's absolutely brilliant. I'm just going to take us back down to a kind of a more sort of less free time, shall we say. So lockdown, which was when a lot of people kind of discovered what was on their doorsteps, and a little further afield, and the uptick in people getting outside and doing the sorts of journeys that Lucy was talking about there, certainly went up. The benefit I want to talk about is the advent of Zoom, where we all here today. And the reason I say that is because something extraordinary happened at the Wildlife Trusts. There was a collective strategy put together across all 46 organisations. Those of you that know us will know that we're federated, we're 46 local organisations and one central team supporting them. And actually to come out with something that where people are prioritised alongside wildlife. They're the same side of that coin. And the fact that we've got these goals where people and wildlife are absolutely central to it. So it joins across. If you look at the 3 goals across the top, connecting up nature's recovery, which plays a valued societal role, both locally and globally, and an ambition for 1 in 4 people to be taking action. So we've got a collective place, so we move towards 2030. And this shows that actually, if we're going to restore nature at a global scale and a local scale, on land and at sea, it really has to happen now. But critically, it only will happen when local communities are supported and empowered to become agents of change, really. And individuals and businesses and all sorts of other entities can act together across society. And so there's really fantastic sentences. I'm really proud to stand behind this, the strategy that says, people will arrive at the world that we know and love from very different places. And this is, to me, the critical success factor behind what we're trying to do. What nature means to the vast majority of the population is different to the third of the people who are already connected and know it quite well. And we really need to get to grips with that. We're operating in a society where everybody's touch points and points of entry will be vastly different, often to our own, and particularly reflecting the environment sector. If I could kind of talk to us all about that, you know, refer to us as some kind of amorphous blob. At its heart is biodiversity, and absolutely agree with Lucy, it's a great theme. So I've just thrown in a few things. So fungi, if we all know, they're not plants, they're not animals, they're a separate kingdom of life altogether, more closely related to us. And they can do incredible things. You can see one bursting up through the road there. They make Kevlar out of them, it makes bulletproof vests. The hyphae, or the thin roots, are so incredibly strong. And they can even shoot spores up into the sky and change and control the weather. Now, with so many health professionals, I'm going to get a little bit more nervous here because I've become onto shakier ground. But GFP, green fluorescent protein, I have to read that one out, from jellyfish is used, amongst other things, as a marker protein. So very important in the field of diagnosis. Horseshoes, crabs, blue blood, that's used. Obviously, anything that gets injected into ourselves is free of potential bacteria, so very important for the COVID vaccine. And this little fella on the left is the cone snail. And the reason I have brought that one in is because I learned the most about the cone snail from a guy called David Pension, who was a former director of the Sustainable Development Unit at the NHS, and he used to wax lyrical about their kind of conopeptides, these non-addictive toxins that can disarm prey, that have been really, really valuable in the world of non-addictive anesthetics. And I loved that because it's absolutely amazing, but it also shows where you can learn these things. And the fact that this is somebody who was deeply involved in the NHS, I found really inspiring. Of course, we understand and know the risks. There are billions more, known and unknown. The risks are really obvious. If we push back nature into ever smaller pockets, filling the seas and oceans with human-created waste, toxins and runoff, then you know the rest. So, you know, and it is really something that we are having to wake up to, particularly in current circumstances in the UK. I did promise Vicky some policy content, so here we go. In terms of biodiversity, some of you may remember spring 2019, the Chancellor of the Exchequer commissioned an independent review on the economics of biodiversity, and that was led by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. The economics of biodiversity. Can you imagine that in our current circumstances? The review's key message was that we are failing to manage our most precious asset, nature. And despite our economies being embedded within nature, it is not valued by our current economic system. So we went further as wildlife trusts, and really we have calls to stop investing in nature destroying industries, but actually start investing in nature's recovery, and really have strong goals and targets around that, and make nature central to our education. And that was actually one of the key findings of the Dasgupta review. Learning about our natural world, embedding that within the education system at all levels, having, of course, yes, a natural history GCSE, that's one point, but it's not the kind of be all and end all. It's how are we going to ensure that it's not one of those sideline subjects that people take, you know, as an add-on, but actually it becomes threaded into absolutely everything we do. And it's a critical public health aspect. And if you kind of, if you look at what we are facing today, then I think, you know, we've actually got a really, really strong and growing argument. So we need nature on our doorsteps. That much is clear. We've heard that from Lucy. But also, I think it's really important to say that we cut through that kind of evidence and we break it into people's everyday lives. So there's some really great work going on from Natural England at the moment around green infrastructure standards. And basically it's looking at people's access to nature and those levels. And we know there are countless studies. There was a great one from the University of Glasgow going back to 2008 that basically says, if you're well off, the greener the area that you live in. If you are at the poorest level, you have the worst health outcomes by comparison to those in the comparatively well-off areas. But nature and green space in particular, and that has the greatest effect on your health. So what are we going to do about that? How do you translate that into policy terms? Well, you can campaign. If you Google nature for everything after this, there's still a live petition out there, which is brought together by Wildlife and Countryside Link. That is looking at what Lucy mentioned earlier, that right to nature. I was really happy to hear that language. That is actually putting in law, some of you may have heard of the Accessible Natural Green Space Standards. It's taking that and actually making it so that you have to have, within 15 minutes of where you are, because a third of us don't have this, accessible, natural, biodiverse green spaces. And we heard again from Lucy about the importance of the biodiverse aspect. We have, in policy terms, something to grip onto here. We've got abundance targets. You might not know this, but by 2030, we have to have shown that nature is in recovery. And that's what a lot of the battle is about at the moment that you might be seeing across the airwaves. At a recent Wildlife Trust conference, we had the pleasure of James Sanderson, who's director of NHS Personalised Care at NHS England and NHS Improvement, and until recently was the CEO at the National Academy of Social Prescribing. We also had Dr. William Bird, who will be well known to many of you. And what I learned about resilience is that it's a response to acute stress. This is one way to describe it. And if you are resilient, you're able to recover more quickly and go again. If your resilience is low, you get chronic stress. And this creates chronic inflammation, which goes on to cause all sorts of preventable illnesses. Now, what I also learned was this is the only a social prescription, if you like, connecting somebody with a group who might take them out into nature, or go to an art club, or go to a cooking club, or those sorts of things. These are some of the only things that a doctor can prescribe. That's what William Bird said. There are so many other things that don't particularly work or are not very effective. So he wants that social prescription. And what he also said is what we need is a kind of a feedback link. So the people that actually benefit from this go back and tell their GP and tell their health worker, actually, this is what worked for me and why. So something that really admires it. We've got our own kind of marketing team, if you like, which was a really interesting way of putting it. He also said that if you do that gentle exercise, that walk through nature, there are no contraindications. There are no reasons to not do this anymore. So we're in a really kind of confident place. And I think as a sector, we have this really effective model that fits with the whole personalization approach. We have experience, so you can spend that time in nature, but for that we need to recover it. You can participate, so we have those kind of volunteering groups, and then we can have those interventions for those that are a specific need. And so again, I think it's a really important time in the terms of the Green Prescribing for Mental Health programme, and there is a case for support going to government on the 4th of November. We're working really hard to try and expand and extend that pilot, because actually it's just starting to make those impacts locally where we're taking the weight out of the health system. And that is really important. We need people in the health system to say that.
2 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much. That fits perfectly. You'll have seen perhaps hashtag attack on nature, hashtag defend nature. What sort of country we're living in is on the line. And I don't want to kind of belittle what's going on at the moment, or even overplay it, should I say. But in the crosshairs are wildlife, clean rivers, meadows, woodlands, public health. And away from the slogans and some of the kind of empty words of reassurance, we need to know that our life support system is actually under attack. Changes to the farming system, where you might just revert to area-based payments rather than a public money for public goods, access, or biodiversity, that's at risk. The laws all coming over from the EU, 570 environmental laws could all disappear at once. And the reassurance at the moment are those words saying, no, we're going to have the strongest protections in the world. It's got to be in writing, it's got to be in law. And the investment zones, areas that are basically entirely free from environmental protections. I'll put a question mark in there because they're very open to question at the moment, but it's moving fast, too fast, because there are years and years of work being undone here. So this is also an attack on health. And we've seen the health inequalities and disparities white paper disappear too. And so I don't want to kind of go too far down the political side, but that is what it has become recently. However, reasons to be cheerful. I don't want to leave on that, Sana. I want to talk about, very briefly, Healthcare Ocean, your colleagues there, so Georgie Soman and Richard Hickson. They've started something called Healthcare Ocean, which is absolutely amazing from a clinician's point of view. And Georgie proposes 3 domains through which to organise across the NHS. Healthcare's impact on nature, which is currently, that's only kind of carbon footprint qualified, but starting to look at the pharmaceutical pollution and procurement routes and those sorts of things, microplastics. Healthcare's role in improving access to nature, and especially those with least access, we've heard of that's important. And healthcare's roadmap to biodiversity net gain. What a wonderful set of domains and principles with which to kind of drive culture change across the NHS. And I think greener NHS, work of NHS Forest and sustainable healthcare is massively important. So definitely do all that. I just want to say thank you as well. It's a real privilege to be able to talk to you and alongside some really inspirational colleagues. Let's just remember our resilience. Remember that we need to spend our own time in nature. And if we all reach one person and they reach one, we'll have an army of people that will kind of defend nature as well as get those benefits. So go out there and keep kissing those frogs. And I mean that in a kind of the frog is a negative sense, which is probably not the right thing to say. But the more and more we go out there and have those conversations, I think the more princes and princesses that we find and more converts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Don, that was magnificent. Thank you so much. I think I was moved deeply by, I think, this radical reframing of people being central to the goal. I think so oftentimes there's this kind of leftover legacy where we keep on contrasting nature with ourselves. So it's really incredible to hear that as being so central to the work that you're on. I'm now going to move us on to our final speaker for the first session for today, to Andrew Tempenny. So Andrew is a chartered landscape architect and technical director at Stevenson Halliday, an RSK company with over 21 years of experience across a wide array of landscape projects at all scales. He is particularly interested in green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and regenerative design to create resilient and equitable outcomes and futures. So thank you so much for everybody who's been adding questions to the chat. Please do continue bringing them in, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can in the following question session. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. What I'm going to do today, so I'll just first of all share my screen, and hopefully we can all see that. I'm going to be talking a bit about the nature of design today. So I'm going to be talking about it very much from the perspective of a landscape architect, so a designer and landscape strategist, and my sort of view on nature-based solutions and how we can develop principles to make those happen, and how to do nature-based design to realize its kind of full impact and potential, really. And this kind of builds on our learning from other projects that we've done and ideas that we're applying in our ongoing work with supporting Centre for Sustainable Healthcare at Southmead with their brilliant programme of nature recovery projects there as well. And hopefully alternative perspective, but it will complement a lot of what Lucy and Dom have just been talking about. So really the main sort of focus of what I'm going to be discussing over the next few minutes is the idea that everything's connected. We'll come back to this at various points through my slides, but I think really this is the cornerstone of successful regenerative and nature-based design approaches. It builds on what John Muir once said, and we'll come back to him a bit later as well. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it's hitched to everything else in the universe. And we see this in the link between evidence and underlying need and the impacts that effective and well-planned nature-based projects can have. But we also see it when nature or nature connectedness is missing, or rather, we see the loss or the negative consequences of not having it. So take, for instance, landscape, the integrating spatial framework for nature and the setting for every aspect of our lives, both in the past and still now. But of course, as we see here in this old image, we were once closely connected to life on the land, the elements and the seasons, and arguably had a much greater understanding of the connection between cause and effect and a greater nature connectedness than we do now in many instances. Of course, there are exceptions with the ancestor civilizations and the connections to land and sense of stewardship they had and still have, as we witness here in the art of Indigenous Australians in the dreaming. So their stories of how things came to be. Here we see the rainbow serpent, the giver and protector of life, as rainbows were linked to the presence of watering holes, but also the idea that it's very sort of fierce when provoked, as nature and natural forces are, or can be. And landscapes and what we would now call ecosystem services, their ability to provide food, fuel, water, materials for building and for industry are as old as civilization, as of course is their capacity to delight our senses. And we see this in the ancient gardens of Mesopotamia and the wondrous combination of horticulture, theatre and hydrologic engineering, as it may or may not have been realized in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon here. It's also a nice illustration of the role that landscapes, microclimates and natural systems play in how our cities, towns and villages have always been sited. So that's provided by this photo here of Rio Maggiore and the Italian Riviera, surrounded by lemon groves and olive terraces. Landscapes all around us, but that's something that we can often forget, along with nature connectedness, particularly in the cities and towns that so many of us now call home. So what I'm going to talk about now sort of very briefly is our approach to nature-based and regenerative design to begin restoring some of these connections and the ways in which we can bring nature-based solutions into the mainstream, recognizing their invaluable contribution to solving global societal challenges. And I won't dwell on this slide too much, as we will all be familiar with the often frightening big picture issues in our century and the meaning that nature-based solutions are more fundamental than ever. Then, of course, there's the spotlight that COVID-19 shone on nature, the natural world and our green spaces. So whether that's the harsh picture it painted of inequalities to access, or the increasing recognition of the value of nature and the outdoors to our health and well-being. And then there's the associated need to value nature and nature recovery, and for it not to be divorced from economics and growth. And that was one of the headline messages of the Dasgupta review that Dom was mentioning earlier as well. And really, I think we come back to the idea that everything is connected. This applies to the best types of nature-based design too. Really, it's about systems thinking to properly understand where the connections and the links are, kind of cause and effect, and how they link into a wider or multifunctional web or network. Nature-based solutions are then, I would argue, really at the core of delivering regenerative design outcomes, another increasingly relevant concept in today's world that give back multiple benefits and create a sort of fairer and more equitable societies. And we can, of course, look back to historic writing for the anecdotal view to understand in some ways that nothing has changed. And there is the continuing need to build hard evidence for the benefits of nature to articulate what we already know. And this the quote here from J.C. Loudon, it's 200 years old, but it could almost have been written yesterday from when we look at what he's saying here. And likewise, a slightly more provocative standpoint from John Muir, with that sort of message in the Yosemite, which was written towards the end of his life, just a few seconds just to kind of read and look at what he's saying there. But I think, again, equally relevant in lots of ways now. And if we come back to the idea of landscapes and nature continue to be the setting for every aspect of our lives, it's worth a look at how some cities perform in things like quality of life indices, which are published from time to time. So here, for instance, is San Luis Obispo in California, which has often been referred to as America's happiest city. And I think there's a clear link back to nature connectedness around the natural advantages of its dramatic landscape and seascape setting for its citizens. And then building on that quality of life in our cities and towns, there's things like urban green infrastructure. So the really fantastic Bosco Verticale by Stefano Pueri in Milan, for instance, where there's a really rich array of ecosystem services and natural capital assets and really truly beautiful urban environments. All the connections with life on land at a more micro level. echoing some of those comments by Muir earlier. So things like growing and community gardens and therapeutic horticulture, for instance. Perhaps the fact that landscape and nature are the background to many aspects of our lives is, in some ways, has been part of the problem in the past, and their invisibility until they're lost almost. Humphrey Repton here recognised that they didn't just happen, but it seems that that's something that we still need to kind of get across. And we really need to bring nature-based thinking into the mainstream. So with that in mind, I've sort of identified 5 broad principles on how we might be able to do this from my sort of years of working in landscape and green infrastructure projects. Firstly, about thinking in circles and trying to close as many loops as you can through the design process, looking at where the opportunities are. So in this project, for instance, that we worked on, it's not a healthcare project, but it has this idea of using the natural constraints, but also the opportunities, things like natural flood management and large-scale habitat creation. So creating a whole sort of landscape and habitat network and an accessible nature resource for people as part of the wider circular economy kind of thinking behind the master plan for this project. Or another scheme that we've been working on, where we were working on a historic Chartist settlement. And lots of people will know that Chartists were all about life on the land and self-sufficiency. And it's really trying to reimagine some of that around community food growing, therapeutic horticulture, essentially creating programming for those opportunities through the design and creating kinder and fairer, more equitable society and communities through that design process. But closed loop thinking, I think, is nothing new, really. Landed estates here, like Cassiebury, about 200 years ago, were effectively self-sufficient communities. And they were doing this for centuries of things like silviculture for food and fuel, but also creating incredibly rich and biodiverse landscape mosaics. So there's a lot we can learn from history. But it's about making these ideas about design and management for the many, rather than the few, as this place was. And with principle 2 in mind, coming back to that everything is connected, the more positive mirror image of the slightly flippant slide here is that it's all about collaboration, shared skills and mutual respect, and filling the skills gaps to realize the best and most integrated nature-based outcomes that tick the most boxes. And coming on to, okay, thank you, nearly there. And coming to that, really, it starts to lead us to principle 3, and it's all about evidence. Firstly, there's the qualitative aspect. So here's my interpretation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as it can be related to nature-based design and the various benefits that that can bring. But in terms of the quantitative side, it's really essentially about benefit flows and valuation. And I will talk a little bit about kind of approach that we've developed within RSK with our colleagues at ADAS, essentially around the qualitative and quantitative benefits of nature-based interventions. A very simplified example here, this is one where it's about natural capital assets, ecosystem services, and beneficiaries. Here, the natural capital assets, the geology, and we're looking at cultural services in terms of health and well-being and recreation for the family at the beach there in that image. But how can we get there? So essentially the approach that we've derived is a 6-step process around identifying objectives, outcomes, and benefits that could be delivered by a nature-based solution, assessing impacts, whether they're positive, neutral, or negative, considering things like time and management as well. But then essentially defining a methodology to assess the benefits of ecosystem services delivered by a nature-based solution and applying expert judgment to the magnitude or the impact and applying a kind of high, medium, low or red, amber, green scoring. And then using that as a basis for kind of monetized valuation, using in our case, our in-house RSK ADAS nature capital valuation tool to quantify benefits and apply existing valuation evidence to develop calibrated monetized estimates of value around nature-based solutions. And this is just an example of how that process might play out in terms of natural capital assets, the type of ecosystem service benefits, who might benefit, and the kind of level of benefit that we could ascribe. 4 is really about mapping project priorities, outcomes, and beneficiaries, and repeating that throughout the kind of design process and coming back to that at various points to make sure that those things aren't being missed. And finally, number 5, I think good nature-based design is really about a roadmap that's flexible or should be adaptable, and particularly the changing times we're in. So it's scalable, replicable, and essentially resilient in itself for those reasons as well. And that is it. So thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you so much for everything that you've just pointed out. And I think also giving us a sense of another perspective on how we can look towards practical implication. I think there's lots of crossovers for across the domains. I think this point of dissolving silos is really, doesn't matter where you look, the kind of response towards the planetary crisis has that really much at the core. And I think really its emphasis on connections is really key. So thank you so much. So with the following time that we have, I'm just going to move through some questions to our speakers. And I will do my best to not make too many changes, and where possible, I will try to give note to who is given the question, but apologies in advance. But just first question, Lucy, you described awe in the place that you walk through. How can we experience awe in busy, hectic workplaces within built environments? Would you have any tips for micro awe?
What a good phrase, micro awe. Thank you. Well, I mean, awe's subjective, isn't it? But we know, as I mentioned, that a lot of awe experiences today do come through the natural environment. So I don't know of any kind of evidence. I can't really speak to kind of examples of awe in the built environment, but I guess my feeling would be that if nature is kind of threaded through built environments and threaded through urban areas more than it is now, then there would be more opportunities for awe. I think we often think about awe as being something, an emotional reaction to something vast, like a waterfall or the Grand Canyon and so on. But, it doesn't have to be like that. Yes, I'm a complete nature geek, but a lot of my awe experiences are from like micro animals, moss, lichen, really common species that are all over the place. And I suppose when thinking about awe in the working environment, probably increasing opportunities for awe would involve things like being able to take more lunch breaks, have walks in your lunch break, kind of looking at culture of overwork, presenteeism, that kind of thing. I think that's all connected. I'll shut up now. I'm sure other people have things to say.
Thanks, Lizzie. But I'm also mindful of the photo that Dom shared of the mushroom bursting through the concrete. I think even walking through the city, nature kind of allows itself to be seen. And you also sharing the plant behind you as well. So again, it is about, I think, directing attention. For Dom, I think, well, just as a follow-up question to one of your points, you mentioned this idea of different touch points for nature. How do we create space for those different touch points to be recognized and valued beyond traditional nature dialogue? So I think there's something about this question that reflects the understanding that not everybody has that equitable access. And so if one of the barriers is the way that we talk about nature, how do we address that? So again, I've done my best to interpret that a bit.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and really quite one for the present as well. I think the first thing is we have to look at ourselves. I'm part of a sector that is, not very diverse in particular ways, certainly in terms of visible, marginalized groups, people who are, from ethnic groups, from visible ethnic minorities, are not very well represented in our sector. And what I think we have to change the makeup of who works and who are our trustees and who are our leaders. That's the first point. And then that will filter through to how we engage. And there's a real challenge with social route into our sector. Traditionally, I think people have been supported for 6 months because they need volunteer experience. That gets you a certain kind of background and type of person. So once you've started to actually filter that through and change the way that we are, and you've taken this active, certainly we need to take an active kind of stance on a lot of these things and HR approaches and change our kind of conditions so that actually you provide those experiences rather than saying this is what you need at entry level. That's a start. I think the other point I would say is our goal 2 is really important, if I could take us back to that strategy slide, which is about 1 in 4 people taking action for nature. Clearly, we're not going to get that with the current third of the population who we engage. So that is about a ripple effect going through the communities. And it's about going the stuff off reserves and listening program. And in fact, social prescribing is quite good at that, because that's all about what matters to you rather than what's, and so if you need those listening programs, you need the ripple effects, and that way you could actually hear what people's touch points are, because I don't know. I'm certainly not the best person to answer that question. We need the people involved who can legitimately and authentically ask that question, and then from there we go. but it's getting urgent.
Thanks, Dom. Andrew, this is a question for you. And how you mentioned sort of we have this amazing image of the dreaming, and you give reference to the ancient cultures. I suppose moving forward, as this insistence and need for conservation comes about, how do we move forward in terms of being able to reflect and be able to use that, or to represent that knowledge at the same time in this kind of greater effort, where we're not leaving the people who have done that work behind, and then sort of bring them along? I think there's also a slightly similar question as well about perhaps how we frame our language. So these terms like ecosystem services, green capital, urban nature capital, to what extent is this helpful to us? And I mean, it's obviously neither here nor there, but could you speak to your feelings about this kind of clash of modern culture with things that we've presumably been practicing for generations and millennium, in fact?
Absolutely, yeah. I guess to dwell on the second point first, Jacob, I completely agree. A lot of the terminology around nature and natural systems is not particularly user-friendly. And when we look at those various different ones around things like green infrastructure and ecosystem services, and they're often quite mechanistic and not, it tends to kind of divorce it a bit from that sort of human-centric and people-centric focus, which is what I think a lot of the cultural kind of references around ancestor civilizations and early kind of views of nature and life on land, really. And I think it's really to try and get back to that around sort of, I think more about sort of benefits around things to people, and how some nature and landscapes are really making those links back to how they're really part of the setting of almost every single aspect of our lives and decisions around life and work, and how we live and where we work, and really sort of those connections about where things come from, and supply chains too. So I think that's perhaps part of it, and a lot of that from the work we do can be really around things like I guess sort of like programming and activity in relation to design, and trying to embed some of these sorts of things that put people back in touch with nature and landscapes through design and through management. And that's the kind of big sort of thing I would try and push, I think, as part of that. And it's so that people can start to see these sort of impacts and benefits of things as they experience them, and use them as part of their lives, really. But hopefully that answers the question to some extent.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm mindful that there's sort of 2 minutes to go, but I'll try to move back to the beginning again. Lucy, this is a question as well. I mean, I think it applies to so many of us here, but can you speak to a bit about how you came to understand that nature was something that was going to kind of open up the possibility of recovery in some sense? Because I think that can also be a sort of learning point that we can take away in terms of how we have conversations with people, and how we sort of bring that discussion more broadly, and maybe perhaps get to the point that Dom's question had about touch points. You know, how do we communicate that to people?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think for me it was going into this natural space Walthamstow Marshes, and initially going there to run, because I knew that endorphins, it might boost my endorphins and boost my mood. But then I found myself kind of slowing down and walking and just taking in the trees and the kestrels and the plants and so on, and then coming back to my flat and feeling like there was a kind of really powerful effect on my particularly critical thoughts and kind of rumination and brooding, and thinking something's happening to my brain when I'm in this space, what is going on? And then I think, you know, hands up, from a very kind of mechanistic empirical science type Western world, I needed proof. I needed, you know, I still had this sense, this kind of naive sense that nature was something nice and, you know, a bit of a luxury. So then it was going into the research and the evidence, and really just being blown away and having my mind kind of blown by all this evidence, you know, which is complex, and obviously mental health is complex, nature is complex. So then I think it was a case of connecting in a way that I tried to do in my talk, the different parts of the body and the different parts of cognition, and finding out, you know, oh, it really does make a difference to your stress. It really can make a difference to the rumination in your brain and so on, and kind of, and making those links explicit. So that was kind of what deepened my addiction to it, probably.
Thank you so much, Lucy. So we're just now at 3 o'clock and we're going to move to the break. I mean, again, thank you so much to our initial speakers. A big round of virtual applause for the three of you for really setting us on the path. Very much appreciated. Hello, everybody, and hope you're back from your breaks. We'll just get started and keep up the momentum for the afternoon. So even in that short amount of time, I'm sort of buzzing with all the ideas, and I think that's very much reflected in the chat, which is equally bursting with excitement and questions. So for the next section of the day, as we move through, we'll be hearing from 4 speakers, followed by a 10-minute Q&A, much in a sort of similar structure as we've just had. Please put your questions into the chat at any time, and if you could identify the speaker who the question is for, again, it helps us get through more questions in the limited time that we have. So the title of our next presentation is People Permaculture at the Mount Vernon Cancer Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jeannie Bakar, with the Cancer Support Information Services Manager at the Mount Vernon Cancer Center in Northwest London. After a management career spanning the commercial, public, and charity sector, Jeannie moved to the NHS in 2010, firstly for a mental health trust, and for the last 8 years has been at the Mount Vernon Cancer Center. Currently works as a service manager for cancer support and information. She's been instrumental in devising the Nature Recovery Ranger pilot with CSH, which I'd encourage everybody to find out more about as it continually goes from one success to the next. Jeannie, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I will just begin to share the screen, I hope. Thank you very much. Okay, so I hope you can all hear me. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I am lucky enough to have spent some time exploring how outdoor space can be utilised for staff health and wellbeing at Mount Vernon Cancer Centre. And I'm pleased to say and delighted to say that what has now become quite a significant outdoor space project has been fantastically embraced by our staff. So I have chosen the title People Permaculture to say in particular in terms of staff engagement, what has contributed to this, our success. So I'm going to spend some time looking at, giving a brief timeline of our experience to date, have a brief talk about complexity, before looking at what success looks like to me, and describing the 7 Ps and the 6 Cs that I think were major factors in our experience. before telling you a little bit about Hugelkuta. Okay, so in March 17, our journey started, and I will, with a conversation with the London Healthy Partnerships, and I will give you a direct quote. They said, if you're interested in green healthcare, I suggest having a look at the Centre of Sustainable Healthcare. Well, never a true word was said. And in November 2017, another critical point in our journey was the presentation that CSH gave to our clinical governance. Because this is an opportunity to provide a vision to our clinical board and a wide range of our staff, team and senior management about what could be achieved, and really help to stimulate our conversation across the organisation. This followed by CSH securing funding of the Health Foundation Workplace Wellbeing Research, which we took part in, and also funding from the Heathrow Community Fund, which funded our chemotherapy garden, our walkway and our ward gardens. Okay. The work on the fern garden started in 2020, just as COVID hit, which of course made things challenging, but as people have already said, you know, the COVID kind of brought a new resonance of outdoor space for our health and well-being. Also in October 2020 was the launch of the Space to Breathe report, which we took part in. And this was, again, fundamental because it gave us fantastic, you know, high quality evidence that our staff was involved in to support our application and our vision for an enhanced walkway. And we achieved, we were able to secure additional funding from our own hospital charity to get that started. We continued our collaboration with CSH and secured the Green Recovery Challenge, and it was fantastic again to work with them on their project, which saw, as you heard in the introduction, the new Nature Recovery Ranger posts, and our own Nature Recovery Ranger was, you know, a real life force in really skyrocketing staff's engagement in the outdoor space work. And I think the culmination of the work was in August this year with the launch of the Space to Breathe map. Okay. So a little talk about complexity. When we're talking about staff engagement, how complex is that? Well, really not at all. Of all the projects that I've been involved with, the outdoor space one has one that's been, you know, most enjoyable. I don't think there's, you know, nearly 100% of the conversations have been welcome, you know, received welcome and warmly and with positivity. And I don't think we should be surprised by that. We've heard already the empirical evidence that supports why, you know, outdoor space is so important to people. In the own research that we took, with the CSH, 86% of our staff said they would like to spend more time in green space, and they reported saying they feel more relaxed, calm, refreshed, and energized. Okay. And so in this context, what am I defining our success is? What did it look like? Okay. So you can see here, I've arranged a kind of a variety of our sort of photographic evidence of our project. And you can see from the photographs, you can notice the uniforms, that we had got more clinical staff involved. In 2017, we struggled to create a staff walking group, okay, and participation being very low of a few people. Now with our event, with some of our events, we've capped over 100 people getting involved, which is fantastic. And as I said, again, this is from a large range of our patients. On wellbeing events, we solely had admin staff attending, and now on these events, we have a wide range of staff, including clinical people attending. And they're loving it as well, I have to say. So what has contributed to our success? Okay. Going back to the Space to Breathe report, as I said, this was you know, really helpful in our discussions at the Cancer Centre, but it also gave us real tips on how to you know, go forward with our work. they highlighted 7 Ps of areas that can cause barriers to staff accessing outdoor space at work. And we have tried to counter each of these barriers in a lot of the work that we have done. I think one of the most important ones that I would highlight would be permission. Karen's first initiative as Nature Recovery Ranger, and perhaps one of her biggest successes, was an organisation-wide gardening competition that engaged staff's imagination and gave them permission from the organisation to literally get stuck in. And in some cases, she would specifically say, tell staff, yes, you are allowed to do this. The initiative also helped change staff's perception of the site and the uncared for areas where staff took ownership and they were proud of the results that they achieved. The staff gardens were also close to their place of work. And this is just one example of how we have tried to address all of the 7 Ps, and all of them are sort of equally important. Moving on to the 6 Cs, what we have learnt from our experiences as the additional factors that we think are important. I've put constancy at the top because you will have seen from the timeline, this is not a quick fix project. This has taken years to grow, and it's developed year on year, and it's been fantastic to be involved in that. But if I was to pick one that was particularly important to the success, I would probably root out conversations, and that is face-to-face conversations, which all too often can be sort of neglected, particularly in this time and as we're getting used to other methods of communication. But that is the most important in terms of much better impact than all staff email. Creativity has been fantastically important, and Karen has really taught us that. And I think to pick out an example of one of her creative approach, you can see in the background the moon canopy. As soon as that went up, it gave permission, it gave an invite for staff to use it and start having team meetings. And who'd have thought, that the erection of that canopy would have had that immediate effect. The culture, our aim is to not run to change the culture in the initiatives that we choose to do. We want to create an idea of this is the way that we do things around here. And another example of that is the sand trap, where staff can take a walk on the way into work in the morning and look at the sand trap and peer as what wildlife has been sharing the site the night before. All of this takes capacity, okay, which is not readily available. The skill set that Karen has of the engagement, of the practical skills of estate management, of the knowledge, the great knowledge of biodiversity and how to connect, isn't readily available within the NHS. And of course, the creativity of landscape architects and the creation of the woodland walk, and not to mention the knowledge and experience of CSH's network. And this all takes cost, it all has a cost, although I should kind of rephrase that as investment, okay? So lastly, I'm going to talk about horticulture. I can see Karen on the screen and she's going to be impressed by my knowledge that I've learnt here, but I am going to read it. So for those of you who don't know, they are no-dig raised beds with a difference. They hold moisture, build fertility, maximize surface volume, and are great spaces for growing fruit, vegetables, and herbs. Planted with the 3 sisters, sweet corn, climbing beans, and pumpkin, planted together is mutually beneficial and can aid pollination, prevent disease, and keep pest numbers down. We have demonstrated from our experience that what we have done has really begun to bear fruit. However, there is still so much room for growth. We haven't yet explored the full potential of the impact of the outdoor space on health and well-being of our patients and carers. We are yet to explore the potential of therapies delivered outdoors. The focus on nature and our environment has brought into sharp focus what can be done on site to drive the green plan agenda of our trust, which is, cross-fertilisation, if you will. And so ending on a question as to if the outdoor projects has become self-sustaining, I'm sure this will be a real challenge, particularly given the current economic and political climate. But our next priority, I think, will have to be more thorough evaluation and a return to discussion in the terms of returns on the investment that we put in so far, and a translation of this into a business case for a more healthier and greener NHS trust. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So many questions already on my mind, at least, Jeannie, about how you actually managed to do everything. And again, these tantalizing questions about how the next stage of representing that work and being able to keep the momentum. It's now my pleasure to move on to our next presentation, which is a duo, and the title of which is Health Staff Wellbeing, Lessons from the Meadows Health and Wellbeing Project. It's my absolute pleasure once again to introduce you to Cass Crocker, who is working in the Magnificent Meadows initiative in Wales with Plant Life. She's currently on secondment to the National Resources of Wales. The Magnificent Meadows program was developed in partnership with CSH, and that brings me to the second speaker, Andrea Madison, who is with our Green Space for Health Communities lead. Thanks very much to both of you, and handing over to you.
Thank you so much. I am not getting access to share my screen right now. Maybe someone could make me the co-host real quick. Thank you so much for having us. So I'll get that on the screen in a little second. But it's just really good to be able to speak after Ginny, because a lot of our experiences with staff working on staff well-being are directly linked to our work on the Space to Breathe report. So that's being shared in the chat, and it's a really robust report that I do recommend everyone take a look at. It's really does bring a lot of research to light.
So Andy, you are a co-host, so you should be able to have your green share screen button.
It is working now. Yes, we'll get that on the screen. Hope you're able to see that okay. So yes, thank you for the introduction. So like I said, Ginny has mentioned a lot of interesting stuff that came out of the Space to Breathe report. And it's really good to see also all the actions that Mount Vernon Cancer Center has taken to follow up on that and really learn from that experience. So I just wanted to highlight really some of the outcomes of this research before we jump into discussing a recent pilot that we've run that really worked to encourage the use of green space for health and well-being. So just to give a bit of background, we worked with 3 different health sites to carry out the Space to Breathe research, and so including Mount Vernon Cancer Center. And the sites varied between 500 and 5,000 staff members, and also in location in terms of being more urban, more rural. And one of the questions that we wanted to investigate among clinical and non-clinical staff is current practices. How do they spend time in green space at work? And it was really interesting. So I'd like to point out that, people did report taking intentional breaks or kind of intentionally spending time in green space through activities such as having a cup of tea outside. But the research really points out that walking is a major way in which people experience their green space at work. So that can be walking around the site or beyond it. And so it's a very consistent way in which that was reported that employees experience green space at NHS sites. A lot of people also reported eating lunch and then kind of taking the time to go for a little walk during their break if they're able to combine those activities. And walking in the course of work was also really important as a way to experience green space. So that sometimes can take the form of, when someone's running an errand, instead of going through an internal corridor, kind of making the choice to go outside and take a path that they know will take them through a green space. So this really points out to the idea that if we want to encourage staff to spend more time in green space, building on walking initiatives, that does provide a huge opportunity for doing that. And it was also very interesting to learn about the perceived benefits of experiencing green space at work. So we worked with two groups, so those that regularly spend time in green space at work and those who don't. And it was good to understand that for both groups, they were really enthusiastic about the benefits of green space. So as Jeannie had mentioned, it's very common that staff reported that it is relaxing and calming. They also said that spending time in green space made them feel happy or positive and reduced their stress levels. So something, again, very important when it comes to health staff, and we consider the other pressures that they are under constantly. And finally, I'd like to highlight the barriers experienced by health staff when it comes to accessing green space. And it was really great that Jeannie was able to highlight those as well, as these are common in across health sites all over the country. So pressure of work in our research was the most fundamental barrier, and that was especially true for clinical staff. But other issues such as the proximity of green space also played a huge role in accessibility for health staff. But it also, it's very important to highlight the cultural aspects linked to the issue of accessing green space. So the permission aspect, the positive ethos around workplace walking, and feeling the support from senior leadership that they are able to take a quick break and go outside is very important. So when that is not in place, that does act as a major barrier for health staff. And I really like this quote here. So as you go on your break, you say, "Come get me if you need me." So we do stay handy. So if that green space is not in a convenient location, again, that is something that's going to prevent people from accessing that, from having that time outside. But again, if they are not encouraged by the leadership, they might as well just think, it's just easier if I stay inside, and then they don't get to experience all those benefits from spending time in green space. So I just want to reintegrate that it is really an integrated approach that's necessary when it comes to encouraging staff to spend time in green space at work. So it's really great to see from the research there is a huge appetite for spending more time in green space, and that really the well-being scores of those health staff that do spend time in green space on a regular basis has shown to be higher when compared to those who don't. So it's a really great piece of evidence there. And this work was really helpful in showing us ways that we could kind of adapt our future projects, or really the way that we try to encourage organizational change within the NHS for the health and well-being of staff. And so taking into account our learnings, we did run a project that was a pilot called Meadows Health and Wellbeing Route in partnership with Plant Life. And Cass is going to share with us a bit more about this pilot, which is a really, really interesting idea.
Thank you so much, Andy, and hello, everybody. So the Heath Park Health and Meadow Wellbeing Route is one of two magnificent Meadow Cymru initiatives created between Plant Life and the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. And the idea was to reinforce a visible link between healthcare and surrounding green space. I should say that Heath Park is in the Welsh capital in Cardiff. I'd be interested to know in the chat how many people we've got joining us from Wales. It'd be nice to hear that. The collaborative working was a critical element of the success of the project. So following an extensive period of desk-based research and consultation with healthcare providers and those managing adjoining green space, we narrowed down to a handful of possible sites. Factors like existing appetite and commitment, together with proximity to existing meadow space, specifically managed for species diversity, were all considered. We set up a steering group made up of members of the University Hospital of Wales, Cardiff and Vale Public Health Board and Cardiff Council to further develop our ideas. And following a number of meetings, this collaboration was then formalised into a memorandum of understanding, or through a memorandum of understanding. We worked with Public Health Board initiatives to align with their existing projects like Move More, Eat Well. We helped cultivate internal relationships and networks, working closely with the hospital employee wellbeing team. We explored what needed to happen to trigger culture change and permissive behaviours that Andy's already referred to around self-wellbeing. I think we're all very good at kind of talking about what can happen to improve other people's health, but what can we do to improve our own health? Helping to identify the game changers who can make this happen. We explored what needs to happen to, sorry, I've said that. We also focused on the growing interest in holistic approaches to healthcare, the value of combining art and nature in order to nurture staff and patients. Next slide, please, Andy.
A few minutes remaining.
So the first step was to encourage people outside through signposting to the green space on their doorstep. We created 4 panels, 2 were sited on hospital grounds and 2 within the park. We mapped 2 timed routes dealing with the barrier of time. We created QR codes to a virtual tour of routes to familiarise users and build confidence. We had QR codes to the Mag Meadows Meadow Hub site to help educate around meadows, increasing knowledge about this important habitat, which both supports species diversity and also mitigates against climate emergency, which lots of people don't know. We also included some light touch messaging about the health benefits, including the one in the caption. Did you know that looking at a wildflower meadow for just 6 seconds can lower your blood pressure? Next slide, please, Andy. So we launched our route on the 11th of May of this year, and it was to tie in with Mental Health Awareness Week. And we worked with comms departments across the project to publicise. It gave us the opportunity to show the routes and perhaps most critically, the opportunity to consult with hospital staff and the local community. It stimulated so many conversations with hospital staff about the logistics of running a staff health walk. For instance, who would manage it? What time would suit people? What procedures needed to be in place, like risk assessments, were they a necessary thing? So lots of good debate from that. Next slide, please, Andy. Andy's already highlighted that there are a multitude of barriers to staff accessing green space, both for themselves and as part of patient rehabilitation. So as a project, we explored ways to increase confidence about accessing these routes, but also we worked at looking at ways to bring green space inside and into the minds of those within the hospital, even if they were unable to actually get outside. The next couple of slides show a quick overview of how we achieved this. This slide has some screenshots from a bilingual story map created for the project, which provides a virtual tour of the route together with images and details about the nature of Heath Park, as in the nature that existed in the park. And I hope that Lucy doesn't mind if I borrow her eloquent phrase, moments of soft fascination. This story aims to build confidence and help people access those moments of soft fascination. Thank you, Lucy, it's a brilliant term. Next slide, please. The other approach we took was commissioning a yoga video, which aimed to bring the inspirational qualities of meadow sights and sounds together with the benefits of movement into the hospital. This video sits within the story map I mentioned in the previous slides and also on the Public Health Wales and Employee Wellbeing Service digital channels. And it's aimed at those with lack of mobility, either as patients on wards or as staff at desks with limited space and time. And the practice comprises a sequence of stretches that can be achieved from a seated position. Next slide, please, Andy. This is my final slide, and it's again talking about different ways of connecting, bringing the space indoors. And we worked with a local art school and the Cardiff and Vale Health Charity to create a piece of work about meadows, which would bring the joys of flowers and birdsong into the hospital. The final piece, which measured an impressive 11 foot by 6 foot, hangs in the main corridor and signposts to the walk route through an interpretation board, QR codes, and we hope that even if staff are unable to access the walk route, they are at least reminded of the beauty that lies beyond the hospital walls, and that having that in mind is the first step towards nature connectivity and taking that wellbeing walk in nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Cassie and Andy for even more food for thought in terms of how we can all try to bring these things into implementation. Now moving over to Steve Lau and Tony Poole, who will be doing the next presentation, which is on From Green Wing to the Green Gym. Steve Lau is a former ICU nurse who is an advocate of the outdoors and its capacity for healing. He has a lifelong passion for people and places. Steve supports the Green Gym in a voluntary capacity alongside his work for Northumberland Rivers Trust and the Cresswell Pell Tower. Tony Poole is a nurse within the NHS and volunteers with Freeman's Green Gym and other local conservation groups. She has a love of all things in nature and helped found the Green Gym to combine activities focused on the physical and mental well-being of colleagues, while also addressing the concerning issues regarding climate change and loss of clean green spaces for humans and wildlife to enjoy. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much. I've been involved with the Green Gym now for a little while, about 4 years, and as has already been said, I've got a bit of a checkered history. But what I wanted to do was start off with, you know, a challenge really, and a Dragon's Den challenge. If we had to design a key piece of environmental equipment that was self-generating, that actually produced food and fuel, provided homes and shelter for man and animals, provided places to play, reduced noise, regulated temperature, stabilized soils, alleviated flooding, and reoxygenated the air, what would we do? Oh, of course, we need to combat climate change too. Well, we'd all invent a tree. And one of the, I think, basic things that we have come across over recent years is, in my experience as an ecologist, has been a lack of people's understanding about the role that things around them also play, not just in their lives, but in all those other aspects of their lives. I just want to show my credentials for a moment. I'm going to start with the bad news. I do suffer from mental health issues, and it does make me a little bit grumpy. But I have got a nursing background. And the one thing I would say is, look at this photograph. Never mind who's in it. Look how pale people are, because they're all working inside a clinical environment and never get out to see anything, particularly in an ITU. And look at me now, working outdoors, working with nature, doing a bit of archaeology, a bit of wildlife. I'm a different person. And I don't think I need anybody to actually give me any proof of that, because I know it myself. And as already been mentioned, we've got ecosystem services have been mentioned. And I found that there's quite an interesting quote, because it's from DEFRA, an introductory guide to valuing ecosystems. And they actually say that they're little understood, which I think is almost enough in itself. Oops, my apologies. I'm getting a bit carried away there. So we know we've got more and more people living lives indoors, and that people don't get to spend enough time in nature because often there's nowhere that's easily accessible for them. This has already been covered. And I think it was also quoted earlier that those that have the least access to nature also have the worst levels of physical health and mental well-being. And of course, over recent months and years, we've actually been in lockdown. And we also have a planning system that leads to a lot of little boxes or even high rises where people have even less opportunity to interact with the outdoors. And there's lots of proof that things like seeing birds near our homes or hearing birds from homes, walking through green spaces, along rivers, it actually reduces stress, fatigue, anxiety, and depression. And that wild places can encourage our minds and bodies to recover from illness. I'm living proof of that. And that was one of the reasons why I left the health service, if I'm perfectly honest. So access to spaces like this, although maybe that's, you know, a little bit outside of most hospital grounds, is certainly going to be something that would not only improve health, but also inspire people. And I think that's the other thing I would like to just stress is actually being in nature has so many other effects in terms of inspiration, creativity, thought processes, all sorts of things. A review of a number of studies actually found that the presence of nature led to short-term and also long-term health outcomes. And every type of natural environment, however small, however big, could improve esteem and mood with proximity to water actually having the greatest effect. Now, currently I work for Northumberland Rivers Trust, and I also work for the Cresswell Peel Tower project. The Cresswell Peel Tower is actually a 14th century building with associated grounds and a medieval garden. But I also did quite a lot of education work, and that's where I started. And I think that's something that we can quite easily forget, that we have a family experience that we need to share with, not just with ourselves, but also with other people. Because when I was a kid, I used to spend the whole day outdoors. I never came home until tea time. And nowadays, I think that's a pretty rare thing. Finally, I think just in terms of the chat bit, really, I think decision makers aren't really making that link between nature recovery and our own health, well-being and prosperity. I worked for the Wildlife Trusts for nearly 35 years, and we've gone through the same set of initiatives year after year after year with different names: Local Agenda 21, Biodiversity Action Plans, etc. We really need to get to grips with this, and perhaps the pandemic was one of the ways in which it's brought that slightly more into focus. This is what we need: a bit of lovely space, a bit of culture as well. I'm just going to put that culture word in there, because it's not, sometimes the man-made environment can be equally stimulating to people. Anyway, I wanted to move on now to the Green Gym and the beginning of the Green Gym. Let's just start with saying, I'm going to start with a nice picture of people having had a good day out in the sunshine, and you'll notice there's a range of people there from all backgrounds, children, families, etc. And we're picking up rubbish, which maybe is not the most inspiring thing to be talking about. But Green Gym started with, and in fact continues, with no resources at all. We've had to fundraise ourselves to get any equipment. In fact, most of it lives in my garage. And I don't work for the NHS, but I'm very proud to offer my voluntary time to actually coordinate and assist the Green Gym with the other members of the team, Tony Poole and also Suren Kana Daram. Sorry, Suren, you're not here, but anyway, there. And we've actually put a lot of time into trying to get the groups together, and we've been running it on weekends generally, and we do have a sort of a rolling program, but the difference is that we don't tend to do it on NHS sites. So this is a beach in Northumberland where we've spent a morning, a couple of hours picking up rubbish and having a good old chat. And I think perhaps one slight other difference is that, from my point of view, if nobody does anything, it doesn't matter. They're there, they're part of it. And I think that's an equally important thing to take away. This is a photograph of Cresswell, and when we took on the site, the Green Gym were the first people to come in and start to clear it. And you know, as you can see, a bit of physical work, lots of smiles in there, lots of graft, and what we've got at the moment is a very different picture, which you'll see shortly. We've done a number of cleans. We always have the children in charge. Why not? Because they tell us when it's time to go and everything like that. But we've removed huge amounts of material as well. We've also installed lots of stuff. We've worked with the Rivers Trust and with landowners to plant trees, to create wetlands, and to basically bring wildlife areas back into use. Another beach clean, and a fine collection of hats. This is Cresswell as it is at the moment. It's just awaiting some renovation works. It's being used by people, it's being used by volunteers, and a cup of tea is always the good way to get things going. And we've also started now opening to the public. So although it's not completed, we are getting large numbers of groups who are coming out and just having a little bit of green space that they previously had no access to whatsoever. Some of the feedback we've had, rather than doing any kind of structured analysis, I just thought I'd put up some quotes. One of them, we've changed the way we work to avoid single-use plastics. During a difficult divorce, Green Gym was my sanctuary. So proud to have started this, what a change. This really gives me quality time with my grandson. It was pretty shocking. I was pretty shocked by the amount of plastic we found, and it really makes you think. I'll be up in an recycling campaign. My daughter has decided to follow archaeology thanks to the work we've done at Cresswell. And I didn't realise how much I'd missed this during COVID. There's also been quite a lot of work done by the Wildlife Trust. So I just wanted to share a couple of these pictures. It was My Wildlife. This one, Simone and Stanley in Durham, recovering from brain surgery. Just again, another really brilliant story. We had a lady from London, My Remedy. She was using outdoor space to help with her rehabilitation after arthritic problems. And of course, good old David, who should be on prescription to everybody in the country for the work that he's done in bringing wild spaces in front of people. Why don't we have that on the TV in hospitals instead of some of the rubbish that's normally on there, i.e. soap operas? Thanks for listening.
Hiya. Perfect. So thank you so much, Steve. And now we'll just move to Karen James, who is the commercial service manager for Glenfield Hospital, Leicester, and the founder of the hospital's secret garden, which she discovered almost by accident when she began work. She will be sharing us a video filmed inside of the garden featuring volunteers and staff who were redeployed there during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they'll be letting us know about how that's transformed the garden, but also their lives at the same time. Karen, thank you very much. Oh, you're on mute, Karen.
First one of the day. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to be sharing this afternoon with you to talk you through our little journey, how we've got the secret garden up and running. Could I have the first slide, please?
I'm sorry, Karen, just give me one moment.
Okay. Thank you. Lovely, thank you. So I've called this this little presentation A Time to Reflect. It's going to give you a little bit of an insight into the journey that we've gone through since 2016. Next slide, please. So the journey so far. The secret garden, as Jacob said, was discovered quite by chance when I came for a meeting at the Glenfield Hospital. I looked out of a window and saw what I thought was a grapevine and asked one of my colleagues, and he just said, "Oh, have you never been in the garden?" I said, "No, is there a garden out there?" So we tried to get out. Basically found this vast space that you couldn't go too far. It was so overgrown with brambles and overgrown shrubbery. But then I chatted to my colleague and he told me what it used to be used for. So recognising the potential of what this space could offer to our staff, patients and the wider community, I spoke to our then Director of Estates and Facilities to see, if we could have it as a potential project. And he agreed. He said, "Well, it's yours, do with it what you will, but you've got no budget as usual." So, and that's where our journey started in November in 2016. We started the journey to restore the secret garden. Next slide, please. So, as I've said, the project is currently non-funded, but through the generosity of local businesses, charitable funds, including our own Leicester Hospitals charity, personal donations in both monetary and personal time, including a small amount of capital funds. Today, in brief, we've done quite a lot, and you'll see from the video that's going to follow just how much we have done, but I've just tried to keep it brief for the presentation slide. So, as you can see from the slide in front of you, we've cleared the garden of all the overgrowth and the diseased trees. Unfortunately, there was a lot that we had to take away. following conversations, this was one of the most important parts of the project. We sat with a lot of different potential beneficiary groups to see if we got this space up and running again, what would they want from this space? What were their needs for a space, a green space? And that helped us to design the layout of the garden and also what potential activity programs we could put in place here. We've established good working relationships and partnerships with the wider community. We've also last year we opened a cafe because that was one of the things that came out from the conversations that we had. We've developed 2 very strong volunteer groups linking in with volunteer services from the hospital. We started off quite small. We've now got 2 very active volunteer groups on a Tuesday and Thursday. We've also created new living hedges to increase our biodiversity in the garden. We've created 8 new garden rooms. We've done a courtyard area and a blossom walk. We did the blossom walk last year to recognise, unfortunately, the 21 members of staff we lost during COVID. There are 22 trees in the blossom walk, 1 for each member of staff who sadly were lost, but also one of the trees was to commemorate the Queen Silver Jubilee. I'm looking forward to next spring when that comes into blossom. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Thank you.
Do you want this or the video?
Oh, the video is next. Sorry. Yes,
No
it's just
problem.
jumped. Sorry. Hope you enjoy it.
Lots of sensory things like the rosemary you see to touch and stuff and smell, and the lavender, which is really lovely. Yeah, and it's really nice, lots of volunteers, and they're all really friendly, and you can get stuck in and learn all about growing vegetables and all the different plants, and I learned so much. Definitely has an uplifting effect. I've heard from staff members coming in saying it's, they've been on the COVID ward and we all know what's going on there, and they've come here and they've said it's like walking into another world. The garden does it itself. It picks you up and it rocks you, and it puts you back. If you've had a bad day, come here and it puts you back on track.
I was redeployed into the secret garden for just short of a year. We did all sorts of maintenance in the garden, really loved it. And then as COVID eased off, people started coming back in. So we got to meet staff and saw the benefits of the place. It was obvious the impact the garden had on people's health and mental well-being during this time. It was very difficult because people would be coming in who'd been nursing patients for a long who they'd lost due to COVID, and they came in here to recharge and refresh, and then they went back to the wards and were up to their elbows in it again. And I saw that constantly. And since I was redeployed back into my original job, and I've come here in the role of a volunteer, which I very much enjoy. And I still see people coming in, both staff and patients, on a daily basis, and they're able to restart themselves and go back on the wards each day. It means a lot to people, including the volunteers, who are a good and kind, hard-working group of people. It's made a very big difference to a lot of lives.
My name is Diane. I've moved to Leicester approximately 6 years ago, and after getting the house ready I decided I'd like to do some volunteering. Having volunteered most of my life, and some of it with the NHS, I approached Leicestershire NHS and volunteered in the hospital to start with, but due to COVID obviously everything stopped and I was offered the chance to work in the garden. I liken my experience to the secret garden, a bit like Narnia, where you walk through that gate and you're just in another world. The peace, the tranquility, the prettiness, the changes, everything is just beautiful. And it's so lovely to see visitors, patients and staff come onto the garden and also receive that peace and calm. It's just so wonderful.
My name is Stephen Opera. I'm an interventional radiographer. I come here during my lunch to have a nice time, to receive some fresh air and some sunshine. It's a good place to recharge, to receive some fresh air. It's a nice place with flowers, all the beautiful flowers all around, trees all around, greenery everywhere. So it's a good place for staff and patients to come and relax, have some nice time with the nature and recharge.
Years ago, it seems like yesterday, but also seems a long time ago, when you first invited me up.
I can't believe it's 6 years in October.
I know.
You know,
I know.
And what a journey we've had.
I know.
You know, from walking through the gate and not being able to get through.
I know. Do you remember all that growth? You
I
just
know.
couldn't see the trees, basically.
You couldn't
you?
really. And then, you know, having those conversations with all the potential beneficiary groups, you know, what they'd like to see in the garden. And then getting it all down on paper and then working with the architect Paul, you know, drawing
that was a good time, wasn't it? We had a good time.
Drawing it all up, and then suddenly we got this vision that we could show people, and then start to build the gardens. You know, it's just
it was, and funnily enough, it seemed such a difficult task. It seemed like we were never going to get there, but somehow we believed that we would, and I don't know where that came from. I just thought it was such a lovely project to get involved with, and it didn't matter how much hard work it would mean, because it was hard work and it has been a lot of hard work. But I never disbelieved that we would make it and do this.
I know, it's a strange feeling, isn't it? You know, something was driving us forward. And I think, from my perspective, I don't know about yourself, Sue, I think it was having all those conversations with people about what they think the benefits would be to them and what it would mean to them to actually get this garden up and running. You know, when we had those conversations with the patients, and when we went out to the Agnes unit, we spoke to staff who used to work here,
and all the different ways that they could get involved if that garden ever became a garden at the centre.
And I think that was our drive, wasn't it? Really?
I think it was. I think it was the thought that one day at some point people would benefit from being out in the garden. I mean, part of the project we read about how beneficial gardens could be and all the theory behind it. And so, you know, it was just lovely to be able to put that theory and make it become a reality in a way and bring that garden. But can you remember what it looked like? I mean, it was just...
it was horrendous, wasn't it?
It was just a massive...
But there was that magic to it as well.
There was,
You know, it had that, as soon as you walked in, it got that magic feel about it. It was as if the garden was saying, come on, get me back to, you know. It was just, it was a wonderful feeling. I mean, for me, it was the pandemic hit home. You know, when we started doing little bits and we managed to open it during the pandemic. And that, to me, gave me that sense that the drive we needed to continue with the journey to get it to where it is today. It's been a great journey so far, Sue, and cheers to the next bit.
Cheers, yes, and there's plenty more to be done.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed watching our little video. Obviously, we've tried to compact it down. There was so much more we could have talked about and shown you. So our journey continues. The next steps, we're currently in the process of building our organic garden, which will feed into our Nurture Through Nature project programme. That's the programme where we want to invite lots of different groups to come and get some horticultural therapies. So the activity programmes will be tailored around gardening and horticulture. We're also building an outdoor kitchen at the moment to link in with the organic growing, so people will be able to come and learn how to grow food organically, but also they'll be shown how to cook and eat healthily as well. So that's hopefully going to be finished in the next 4 to 5 weeks, which is great. Next slide, please. And that's it from me. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video. But if anybody would like to come and visit, please do get in touch. The email's at the bottom of the slide. Thank you for listening.
Karen, thank you so much. I think it's, well, really moving to even imagine that that's part of the NHS. And I think that so much more of our work is about helping to change how people think about what it is and what's possible. And also just the power of video, I think, is really an important theme. So we're just going to move to 10 minutes of questions with our speakers. And that's everybody, including Ginny, Cassie, Andy, Steve, Tony, and Karen. But just a virtual round of applause for all of you for all your amazing hard work and your vision, and of course your commitment. I was just going to start from the beginning, as we did with the last time, and with a question to Ginny. And it's a question that's come from both Alice and Charlotte. But effectively, I think probably a lot of these questions are going to be about trying to make the opportunity to ask actual practical questions that people can take away with. But could you tell us a little bit about how you measured behavior change in staff, patient impact? How did you evaluate staff? What form did this take?
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, great question, and something that's really, really important. As I kind of said at the end, I think that's what's going to help kind of keep the work on the agenda and support it. We, during the activities and as part of the funding request, actually, we were required to report on our activity and how many people were getting involved, and so that all of that data has been collected. We've also have, through our involvement in the Space to Breathe report, we have the baseline of that before any of the activity took place. And I hope that's something that we will be able to go back on. I think it would be good to sort of repeat some of that work and compare, before and after. I think, as always, the sort of qualitative data is harder to capture, but I think that's equally as important, as we've seen from the other comments that have been shared from the other presentations. We receive comments from staff and patients all the time about how that has impacted. For example, we delivered Nature Well program, a small taster of how learning about mindfulness in the outdoors is the best way I can describe it. And the feedback from one nurse, talked about how powerful she felt that 5 minutes introduction was, and how she went back home and instead of opening a bottle of wine, she took 5 minutes in the garden to recalibrate herself. And so we've got a wealth of information of things like that we really need to sort of bring together, as I said, in a sort of more formal way to present what's been achieved. And we've got more to do, as I said, around the patient. The patient, we know, for cancer patients and those suffering with it, with those having long-term health conditions, the impact can also be as significant.
Thanks so much, Ginny. I think this is a big question for everybody interested in this area about how do we translate impact into potentially how we go from the qualitative to the quantitative. But maybe we'll try to get that question a bit more specifically. Just for next question, a very quick one from Faye D to Cassie. Was there a connection with Cardiff University Health Campus for the Meadows route?
So Andy and I worked really hard in a quite a short space of time to cultivate as many different links and to get as many different stakeholders investing in the programme from the beginning. We did make contact early on, but of course there's so many different ways to contact, and to, whether it's the physiotherapy department, whether it's through wellbeing, whether it's with students. And actually, Faye and I have picked up a separate conversation through direct message now on Zoom, with a view of maybe doing a research project about how people are engaging in staff lunchtime walks. So we'll put her in touch with the right people to sort of cultivate that link and to explore that further.
Thanks, Cassie. And one more question, because that was quite a quick one. This is just about trying to make spaces that are perhaps less obviously green available, I think, and it's from Terry Smithson. It's important to make these spaces accessible to staff and visitors. However, space is often very limited in care facilities, especially for staff, ! Good to see, and it's good to see examples of nature being brought indoors. Would you have any suggestions or examples of how small spaces have been enhanced and used for nature connection? I guess for you and Andy, but I'm sure this applies to all of us here. But again, question specifically, how do we make the use of smaller spaces? Any practical suggestions?
I can answer that. I think we've seen so many projects that kind of get really creative about it and kind of try to take advantage of what's available within a specific site. So sometimes that can mean, bringing images indoor, because we know that that's very beneficial as well, to just look at an image of a green space. It does provide benefits, or trying to encourage people to look out the window and look at green space that is around. But also with the Meadows Health and Wellbeing route, we've tried to kind of go beyond the health site and look around in these urban areas, what's there, what's available. And our health routes actually go to nearby green spaces. So Heath Park, for example, that Cass showed, is not part of the actual hospital site, but it's nearby. And so it's been great to be able to connect it and to really show people where those entrance points are and what that area looks like. So that is kind of an additional opportunity as well for urban areas that perhaps you don't have that much green space around your actual site, but to see what else is available.
The green space that was on site was taken over by a big COVID block. So it just shows how, certainly within a city, kind of urban areas, that space is at a premium. So directing to other kind of parks nearby was a really important thing.
But I suggest as well that use of remote cameras might be a good idea. You can beam back things like birds' nest and things like that. It's very, very powerful. And there's a story to it as well, which people get quite engrossed with.
Yeah, and something that caught my attention as well was this sort of bringing in the outdoors into the indoors. I thought that panel of the meadow within the hospital is just is such an amazing idea, just to help remind people of the continuity of it. Steve and Tony, I think this is a question that applies, well, a lot of these questions are for all of us, but how have you worked around promotion of the green gyms, or what sort of issues have you had and what have you found most helpful? I know that one of these points made really well at the beginning was the importance of conversations, and this can be kind of never ending well, but how do you get the word out there in regards to the green gyms?
Tony, that's probably a better one for you, really. So I don't work at the NHS, so.
Yeah. So most of the promotion has been done kind of through the communications within the local trust, so within Newcastle Hospitals Trust. So that's been through the comms team, and word of mouth really as well through members of staff that have attended the Green Gym. And we found that some of it has grown from there. We want it to grow further, obviously. Obviously, another thing that we're looking at as well, going beyond kind of the staff thing, is doing what other people are doing with regards to social prescribing, and with the recent kind of person that's been Sally, that's been she's the wildlife ranger that's been what's the word I'm looking for? Recruited. That's the one, Steve. Thanks very much. She is now going to be taking on some of the green gym stuff and pushing that on. So that'll be looking at kind of getting more staff involvement, but also pushing out kind of some of the involvement with patients and social prescribing.
Just to add to that, I think communications is really important, and we're actually quite lucky now because there are so many different ways of doing it, but you need to get people to sign up to it. And I think our biggest problem is actually knowing who's turning up on the day. So now we've actually got things like a WhatsApp group, and we can address that.
Yeah, I think that's been a difficulty for us, is because Dr. Kanagasundram, who's unfortunately not in the meeting at the moment, who was literally kind of was the one that's kind of was the founder of this, and we kind of just all got, me and Steve got involved through various links. He's the one that kind of set it all up, and it's like trying to get other people involved has been quite a big difficulty, and we've all got other commitments. We all work full time in different jobs, so we've been kind of doing this out of our jobs.
Well, I put it in the chat afterwards, but I didn't mention them in the talk, was we're actually utilising projects that other organisations need doing. So we're going and doing them rather than actually coming up with our own. And I think that helps enormously in embedding it into a wider community as well.
Thanks so much, Steve. And Tony, and it sort of brings us to probably our last question for Karen, and one which ties in, I think, this point about the NHS and the communities around it. Karen, you've managed to fund an unbelievable project. It's taken 6 years. I think I wrote down this quote that your colleague said is, "I don't know where it came from." This amazing idea. What's this feeling that kind of drove everything forward, which presumably everybody's been tapping into. But that persistence is incredible. But I suppose the funding is a real practical, concrete question. So could you just walk some of us through about this alternative funding model where you've kind of gone outside of the NHS to look for community support, about sort of what have you learned? What were the sort of the key, I guess, the key levers and the learning points that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, the key learning point from this is never give up. People can only say no. I'm not shy in asking. It was very difficult at the beginning because we had nothing to show people. If you've got a small piece of garden that you've developed, people are more likely to get on board and give you that support. But again, it was just, we spoke to all of our contractors, all our suppliers, our supply chain. You've got a lot of people who come to work on your sites. As an NHS, you've got contractors on sites all the time. And that's who we started off with, was approaching our supply chain to see if local, and it's a lot of them are local businesses, so they like to do their bit. They've got an investment in the hospital themselves. They use the hospital spaces. So you're tugging at the heartstrings in one way, but you've just got to ask the question. and we've done a lot of corporate social responsibility days as well, where companies, again, from our supply chain, you know, they've seen it as a different way of engaging their staff. And a lot of companies do have to do corporate social responsibility days. So, you know, they're now starting to approach me about coming to, if there's anything they can do at the Secret Garden, because, you know, it's very incestuous. This, you know, the contractor, well, they all speak to each other and they say, oh, we're just doing this bit on the Secret Garden. Oh, what have you got in there? You know, and one conversation leads to another. It's a lot of it's been word of mouth. There's also in Leicester, I tapped into, through the local authority, there's a list of all different grants that are coming out. So I'm always constantly looking at that if we match to whatever grants are available. It's time consuming, but fortunately, you know, we've got new leadership in the trust and they do value staff's health and well-being. And our chief exec and the board recognise the value that the Secret Garden project brings. So they've now given me some admin support, and I've got a gardener post as well permanently. So, you know, that we'll start developing a lot further, you know, and going out for a lot more grants, and our charity team help as well. You know, they tap into a lot of grants. So it's just about, one, never be afraid to ask. People can only say no, and just keep on at it. That's all we've done here.
Those are the notes that I had summarizing what you said. Find someone who's good at knocking on doors. Karen, thank you so much to all of you. And again, another round of applause. So in terms of reflections, I think a lot of the questions and answers that we've already been discussing brings up a lot of the points that we've been talking about. So if you go to the next slide, Massimo, please. And so again, there's this question of resilience. I think that's something that's come up quite clearly, is that this idea of biodiversity as an element within nature in of itself helps nature respond to stressors. And I think a lot of what the case studies have showed us today in large part demonstrate that emphasizing nature within health also helps to build up resilience within health staff, but also within our patients as well. And so I think this bridging together of the sort of complexity and diversity of nature, the biodiversity bit, as the underpinning piece towards building resilience is something that has really kind of moved through, has sort of been set up by our initial speakers and demonstrated by the case studies. And then next one, Massimo, please. And then again, I think this is really a fascinating question. And the presentation we had from Dom Higgins really, I think for me, it was a real switch in how I think about this in terms of being able to see a team that's actually looking towards changing the narrative. But is the environment another? Is it something outside? Is it something indoors? Of course, you know, the point that was made by Steve about imagining a technology that could do all these amazing things. I mean, of course, we depend upon the natural world. We're constantly built upon it and depending on it. So effectively, I think part of our responsibility is trying to bridge this story that nature and the environment is something beyond ourselves. Even the examples of bringing in nature, the meadows indoors into those corridors and hallways of the NHS, I think is another excellent demonstration of trying to go beyond this idea of nature being separate from ourselves. And next, please. And connectivity, of course. So we've heard different references to this idea of connectivity, whether it's breaking down silos, whether it's about celebrating ecology and the principles of permaculture, but ultimately understanding that nothing stands alone. You know, ultimately, I suppose maybe our planet sits on its own within the solar system. We're quite unique in that way, but within our planet and within everything else that we sit alongside, everything, when you pull on one string, everything sort of, you can feel that tension being pulled off and married in a myriad of different ways. In a lot of ways, they're unexpected. So I think that sort of humility in understanding that an action will lead to a ripple effect in any number of ways. And I think also the points made about building collaborations is absolutely critical, because I think that also highlights the point of connectivity. And then our next slide, please. And then finally, so our questions for discussion. What would one word you would use to capture your feelings about what you've heard today? And then the following question, what do you see as the key opportunities for transforming the contribution that green space makes to healthcare? And then finally, how can we help you to do that? So again, thinking about CSH, thinking about the resources that you've had here today, what are some things that would be needed in terms of kind of making the most of this momentum and really pushing us forward. So welcome back, everybody. And again, here we are winding down. And thanks for those who shared the words that have helped you kind of summarize the day so far. And just before we kind of bring ourselves to a close, I'm going to introduce Miriam Dobson from CSH, who's been and going to speak to us about the NHS Forest Awards, which have been running since the inception of the NHS Forest. The 5 awards will be presented by Miriam, CHS Green Space for Health Outreach Officer. So Miriam, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, it's been a really, really inspiring afternoon, and I am really excited to be presenting the NHS Forest Awards for this year. If Massimo could share the slides for the awards, that'd be great. Great. 2 seconds. There we go. All right, so without any further ado, I'll move on to presenting the first NHS Forest Award for the year. So our first award this year is for the innovative development of green space at healthcare sites, and we're delighted to present this award to Frome Medical Practice in Somerset. Could I have the next slide? Yeah, brilliant. They've demonstrated that even the smallest scale green space projects can make a huge impact. So a bit about the project. They were keen to reduce the amount of staff food waste that was sent to landfill. So they began taking kitchen scraps to community composter last year. This wasn't enough, so they were successful in managing to secure funding to install hot composters actually on site at the medical practice this year, which has created an effective closed loop system in the practice. From meals, and they're so awareness of the issue of food waste has been raised as a result. 10 of the practice staff has now attended composter training, and they're installing patient information screens to initiate further conversation with the community. So we're really excited to see the impact that this has as the practice continues to fight food waste. So next, we have the award for active community engagement. So a big congratulations to the Grow Well project at Cardiff and Vale University Health for this, which we really is a social prescribing project. It links service users to therapeutic community gardens, and it works with 10 surgeries in the Cardiff area. So this project believes that everyone has a gift, skill, or experience to share. And based on this principle, it works alongside the patients to co-design, co-produce, and sustain these community gardens as thriving wildlife-rich oases in the densely populated grey areas of the city. It runs weekly sessions where it aims to improve health and well-being of those affected by poor mental and physical health, loneliness and isolation. And participants can choose from a wide range of activities, including gardening, harvesting vegetables, arts and crafts, carpentry, creating wildlife habitats, making soup with garden produce, or simply sitting and listening to the birds. And most importantly, there's always time for a chat and a cup of tea. And our third NHS Forest Award this year is for the pioneering use of green space by healthcare professionals. We're delighted to award this to Nottinghamshire Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust for their Green Hub. The Green Hub is a new resource developed by the Trust to support green social prescribing, and it's hosted on the Trust's external website. The site's used by clinicians and service users and patients and the public to access a wealth of information about green prescribing and about connecting with nature. And it inspires and equips teams and individuals to utilise green spaces for wellbeing and recovery. It includes access to gardening packs, advice to attract wildlife, a month-by-month guide to support even the newest gardeners to start their own successful garden, and videos from the gardener at Highbury Community Garden, and an interactive map of green spaces at Nottinghamshire Healthcare. So really interestingly, the Green Hub can also be prescribed. This is through Recap, which is a programme through which digital information relevant to the person and their treatment is prescribed for health, wellbeing and recovery. And since its launch, which was only in March this year, the site's been accessed almost 5,000 times, and there have been over 70 referrals for the gardening packs. And fourthly, this year's NHS Forest Award for successful ways to support biodiversity goes to the Salisbury Cams Garden Project at Salisbury District Hospital. So congratulations to Salisbury. They've really stepped up with their efforts to improve biodiversity and educate about it. And with a 21 hectare site, the opportunities have been pretty amazing. So a key part of increasing education and engagement was the production of a full colour nature guide, complete with illustrations, scientific information and a seasonal calendar, which was written by a staff member. There's also a printed walking guide to public footpaths and natural spaces around the hospital, and there are monthly nature walks for staff and the public, which include doing species surveys, setting moth traps, and they work with the ICU staff and create creative activities in the outdoor space. Staff, patients and visitors are now more connected to the natural environment. The grounds are better managed for biodiversity, and wildflowers, including bee orchids, are flourishing. And so finally, last but not least, we have our annual award for the site that's planted the most trees for the NHS Forest last season. And this year, this goes to Rampton Hospital in Nottinghamshire, who last year planted an incredible 4,120 trees through a partnership project with the NHS Forest, the Conservation Volunteers, and Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. So people on probation planted the trees, and they will actually return to the site over the next few years to carry out aftercare, look after the trees, and also plant some additional trees. These trees will contribute to the reduction of flood risk from a nearby watercourse, and they also form part of the Queen's Green Canopy. So from us at the NHS Forest, a really big well done to all our award winners this year. We think this is an exceptional spectrum of inspiring ways to engage with and use green space. And we also hope that everyone listening here has found some ideas to take away from this.
Thanks so much, Miriam. And another warm round of applause to the winners of the 2021 NHS Forest Awards. You know, I think something to say is that a lot of this work is deeply innovative, and a lot of what we're trying to do, no one has all the answers. And so I think something like the NHS Forest Awards is deeply, deeply important in terms of knowledge sharing and bringing down the silos and helping to expedite this process of change. So for everybody who has been and stayed with us for the end of the conference, but please do sort of spread the NHS Forest Awards throughout your networks. Please let people know that it's going to be happening again next year, because I guess the more submissions that can happen, that can be brought to CSH, the more case studies and best proofs of practice can be disseminated and promoted. Because I can sort of speak from experience that working at any level of healthcare, one of the biggest demands is always about asking, well, what are some examples? What can I do? How do I do? How have other people done it? And so this issue of information sharing is beautifully demonstrated by the NHS Forest Awards. So please do spread the word. So with that, we do come towards the end of what's been an amazing afternoon. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. This is, I believe, a photo of a place close to where I've been working at the Bethlehem Orchard, which is another beautiful example of a green space, and I think highlights just another sort of rich aspect of the NHS that events like these and the work of so many of you who have joined help to kind of promote and sort of continue sort of shaping the type of NHS that we all want to work and be cared for by. Again, thank you for all of our speakers in the first session and for the amazing work done in the case studies, but I guess the amazing work that all of you have brought by sharing your attention and for sharing your ideas. Ultimately, you know, this is an event that you can continue going back to. The resource itself will be brought up online, and please do share that as well. Again, that's another form of trying to help this process move along more quickly and sharing information and sharing links. This sort of element of door knocking, you know, don't be afraid to knock on people's doors and let them know, because you're often surprised what people haven't spoken to or thought of as yet. As I mentioned, yes, the recording will be available, and we will also email follow-up links and any additional resources. And I guess one thing I would just want to close with is something that perhaps wasn't said explicitly, but each of our speakers in some sense related to it, but that almost everybody mentioned some kind of personal practice of nature and engaging with it. And so I think going forward, please, you know, do be mindful how you're going to cultivate your own practice, your own sort of relationship with the natural world, because I think that ultimately something that really does generate and provide that inspiration, that sense of focus and belief that's been sort of mentioned at various points. So, you know, we're coming towards the fall and the winter time. You know, make the most of the seasons, and again, see you next year. Thank you again so much for joining us, and yeah, and thank you again for having me bring us through this day. All the best.